Yeah, because, for Asian menswear, like majority of the audience is Asian American. And there's a lot of times where I run into people who are kind of like grew up like you, where there wasn't a large Asian American community. They had to kind of assimilate with either it's African Americans or white Americans. So I'm assuming if you're in Boston, you grew up where you're probably the only Asian guy, at least in your own community. So I wanted to learn a little bit about like how is life living in Boston, and speak a little bit about like how Boston's sports culture is so big, and I think that kind of influenced you into your career path now.
Sure. Boston is a more diverse city than I think a lot of people give it credit for, and the national reputation gives it credit for. It's now majority minority, which I think surprises a lot of people. But it's an incredibly segregated city. And so the suburb that I grew up in, Brookline, is very Jewish. It's predominantly white. And I went to school with some Asian people, but there wasn't a whole lot of Asian people. I did work on the student newspaper with a couple of fellow Korean Americans and Asian Americans as well. But it was definitely, I think, a pretty common Asian American kind of youth experience, kind of having to assimilate to a certain degree while also trying to maintain your own cultural boundaries. I think Brookline in particular is a pretty liberal and progressive place. And so I felt like I was able to maintain my identity and didn't have to completely kind of, I think a lot of Asian Americans go through kind of a self-hatred process of, rejecting their own culture. I didn't necessarily feel that to the same degree, I think, as a lot of Asian Americans. I did live out in the suburbs of Western Massachusetts for 4 years near Springfield, Mass, where I think I felt a little bit more of that. But overall, I think for me personally, that was not as strong an experience in terms of like the self-hatred of my background. I think I've always been very proud of being Korean American and being Korean and being born in Korea. So definitely a degree of an assimilation process. And I think that sports played a pretty big role in that, because I think more so than any other city in the United States, I live in New York now. New York sports is a really, really big deal here, but it's a bigger deal in Boston because I think it's the kind of cultural currency about what people talk about in the city. It's kind of the water cooler talk. It's the small talk that you have with a stranger. Like if you go to Target there, for example, I didn't realize this was weird until I left Boston, but they'll have a Target dog that's like dressed in a Red Sox uniform. Like I've traveled a decent amount now across the country. Like that's not something I've seen in other cities across the country. Like Boston really, really cares about sports in a way that I think is pretty unique and special. And so, being integrated into that kind of culture and, caring a lot about the outcomes of those games and reading the newspaper, the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, Bob Ryan, Jackie McMullen, Dan Shaughnessy, Steve Buckley, like all these columnists that I read a lot growing up, listening to sports radio, talking with friends about the games last night. It kind of is impossible to escape in Boston. It is just the thing that people care about, and it brings people together in the city in a way that I think is pretty unique.